So, like, imagine you step into a doctor's office, right? And you're complaining of this really complicated full-body ailment,
Right.
but the doctor tries to diagnose you using this completely broken X-ray machine. I mean, the lens is cracked, the radiation is scattered everywhere.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the resulting image is just this distorted, shadowy mess. It it only highlights the fractures and totally obscures all the healthy, functioning tissue. You would never accept a medical diagnosis based on an image like that, would you?
No, absolutely not. I mean, it's a completely flawed picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yet, when it comes to trying to understand the modern Middle East, that broken X-ray machine is, well, it's exactly what most of us are using.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it.
Right. Our view of this incredibly vast, diverse, expansive humanity is filtered through, centuries of rigid stereotypes. It's skewed by foreign geopolitical agendas, and it's just overwhelmingly dominated by news headlines that seem singularly obsessed with conflict and crisis.
Just a constant stream of the fractures.
Exactly, just the fractures. You're getting a picture, sure, but it is a profoundly distorted one. So today's mission on this deep dive is to throw that broken X-ray machine straight out the window.
I love it.
We are entirely bypassing the headlines and the hearsay. We're diving into a really staggering collection of primary sources that meticulously map out the intellectual, cultural, and political landscape of the Middle East. And we're going on a journey from basically 1839 all the way to the early 21st century.
It's a huge undertaking.
It really is. But we are going to rely on the actual words written, spoken, and debated by the people who actually lived it.
Which is so vital. I mean, it's an incredibly ambitious undertaking to map out an entire region's intellectual landscape across 2 centuries. But when we rely solely on secondary summaries or, just contemporary news, we totally lose the texture of history.
Yeah, the nuance just disappears.
Exactly. We lose the nuances, the internal contradictions, and the actual voices of the people who were on the ground, analyzing their own societies and trying to construct their futures. So to do this properly, to really read these sources like historians and researchers, we have to establish a pretty rigorous methodology right from the start.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, reading a primary source isn't just about absorbing the text on page. It requires a specific kind of academic excavation. We have to read the subtext.
Let's ground that concept for the listener. Could you give us a concrete example of this kind of excavation? Like, how should we be looking at this massive stack of documents we have in front of us today?
Sure. We can start with a seemingly mundane document from 1885. It's a letter from the United States consul in Beirut, a guy named John T. Robeson, and he's writing to Alvy A. Adi, who was the 3rd Assistant Secretary of State back in Washington.
Okay, 1885, a diplomat writing to Washington. What's it about?
On the surface, Robeson is just filing a diplomatic grievance. He is complaining that the Ottoman governor in Syria has arbitrarily closed down several American Presbyterian mission schools in the area.
Wait, really? Just to complain about some schools?
Yeah, if you simply read the text literally, it just appears to be a bureaucratic complaint about a localized educational dispute, like a zoning issue or a licensing disagreement. But a researcher must ask why this specific document was written.
Right, because why would Washington care?
Exactly. Why was a U.S. diplomat so incensed about a few religious primary schools closing that he felt compelled to write a formal dispatch to the highest levels of government?
Well, the natural assumption would be that he's advocating for religious freedom or, I don't know, maybe just protecting American citizens operating abroad. But knowing the era, I'm guessing a diplomat in the 1880s isn't writing to the State Department just because a few math and reading classes got canceled.
You are hitting on the absolute core of the subtext there. Those Presbyterian schools were not merely educational facilities. They were the vanguard of American soft power. Oh, okay.
Robeson viewed them as crucial strategic outposts for establishing an American footprint in the Ottoman Empire, which, was a highly contested geopolitical space at the time. The students graduating from these mission schools were learning American English. They were absorbing American political ideals, and they were studying American history.
So it's essentially a long-term investment in cultivating a sympathetic local elite.
That is the exact mechanism at play. Eventually, those graduates would rise to positions of prominence. They'd become merchants, bureaucrats, and local leaders who would be inherently predisposed to cultivate commercial and political ties with the United States.
Wow, okay. That changes how you read the whole letter.
Right. So when the Ottoman governor shut those schools down, he wasn't just enforcing a local educational code. He was actively and intentionally blocking the economic and political expansion of the United States into his sovereign territory. Robeson's outrage in that letter is about a geopolitical chess match, not pedagogy. That makes total sense. So every document we look at today, whether it's a decree from a sultan, a poem from a rebel, or a speech from a politician, we need to be interrogating the author's underlying motives.
Absolutely.
We need to ask, who is the intended audience? What are the unsaid structural forces like economics, imperialism, or social class that are pushing their pen?
Yes, that level of intellectual rigor is our baseline for this deep dive. We have to strip away our modern 21st century assumptions and immerse ourselves fully in the specific, really messy historical context of the authors we were analyzing.
I love it. Let's do it. So to really understand the intellectual foundation of the modern Middle East, the sources suggest we have to start where the very concept of the modern citizen was first introduced to the region. And that takes us to the 19th century encounter with Europe. To set the stage for you listening, this was an era defined by the massive industrial, technological, and military dominance of European empires. The Middle East, which was predominantly under the rule of the Ottoman Empire and the Qajar dynasty in Iran, was facing a profound existential crisis.
It was essentially adapt to this new global reality or be completely consumed by it.
Exactly.
And the 19th century is often framed in popular history as this rather simplistic binary, like a dominant, aggressive Europe imposing its will on a passive, slumbering Middle East.
Yeah, that's definitely the common trope.
But the primary sources we are looking at reveal a much more dynamic, proactive, and internally complex reality. The ruling empires in the region realized that their traditional modes of governance just were no longer sufficient to survive the European threat.
So what do?
Well, they needed to rapidly industrialize, build modern standing armies, and most importantly, centralize their power. And to achieve that centralization, they had to fundamentally alter the social contract. They had to transform their populations from passive, loosely governed subjects into active, legally defined citizens.
And we see this massive paradigm shift officially kick off with the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire, right?
Yes, exactly.
The foundational document here is the 1839 Hadai-Sarif Decree of Gulfain. Reading through this decree, it reads like a blueprint for social engineering on an imperial scale. It essentially guarantees the life, honor, and property of all individuals in the empire, ostensibly regardless of their religion.
Right, which was revolutionary for the time.
Yeah, it's an attempt to create a unified citizenry under a standardized rule of law.
The underlying logic of the decree is really fascinating, too. It explicitly connects personal security to state loyalty. The text argues that without the security of property and life, a person will remain totally indifferent to the fate of their state and community.
Makes sense. Why care about a state that doesn't protect you?
Exactly. They won't invest in their businesses, they won't pay taxes willingly, and they certainly won't fight in a conscripted national army. But if they feel secure, the decree argues, they will become a quote-unquote useful member of society.
Yeah.
It is a highly rational, modern bureaucratic calculation.
But there's a catch, right?
Oh, a big one. The true nature of this modernization project is revealed when we look at how the state viewed people who simply didn't fit into this new urban, centralized model of the useful citizen.
Right, and this is where the friction of top-down modernization really shows. I'm looking at another Ottoman decree from a few decades later in 1870, and this one is specifically targeting the Bedouin tribes in the province of Mosul.
Yeah, the language in that one is incredibly loaded.
It really is.
Yeah.
But wait, looking at it purely from an administrative state-building perspective, standardizing the population is essentially governing 101, isn't it? Like you can't lay train tracks, establish postal routes, or systematically collect taxes if a quarter of your population is nomadic and constantly moving across borders.
Right.
So from the Ottoman central government's point of view, wasn't settling the Bedouins just an administrative necessity?
Well, that is the exact rationale the central government used, and it's a powerful one from the perspective of an imperial capital trying to build modern infrastructure. But the intellectual leap the decree makes and the mechanism of oppression it employs is in how it frames that administrative necessity.
How so?
The text doesn't just say, hey, we need you to settle so we can tax you. It draws a stark, irrevocable moral distinction between the nomadic lifestyle and the life of cities and villages. It actively frames urbanization and agriculture as the only legitimate paths to civilization.
Ah, so they're completely delegitimizing the Bedouin way of life.
Completely. The Bedouins, with their mobility, their distinct tribal governance, and their independence, were framed not just as an administrative hurdle, but as a primitive, backwards threat to the modern state. The decree uses the lofty language of modernization and progress to intellectually justify the forced assimilation and control of an entire minority population.
It's modernization imposed by force. But not everyone on the receiving end of these reforms was buying the central government's rhetoric, right? People were deeply aware of the hypocrisy.
Oh, absolutely. The intellectuals of the time were all over it.
Yeah, which brings us to a brilliant piece of intellectual critique from the 1880s by Mirza Malcolm Khan. He published a satirical journal called Qanun, which translates to law, and he aimed his pen directly at the Iranian Qajar dynasty, which was attempting its own version of these top-down modernizing reforms.
Malcolm Khan was a razor-sharp intellectual. He saw right through the grand, modernizing rhetoric of the central government. He realized that beneath the shiny new facade of European-style ministries and bureaucratic titles, the actual day-to-day governance of Iran was profoundly corrupt, inept, and completely disconnected from the needs of the people.
And he used satire as a weapon to expose this hollowness.
I did.
His analogy in this text is just fantastic. He compares the Iranian government's highest defense council to an abdarkhana.
Yes.
For context for you listening, an abdarkhana is essentially a pantry or a coffee house where servants prepare drinks. It's a very lowly domestic space. So he's essentially telling his readers that the nation's highest military command, the people tasked with defending the country from Russian and British imperialism, are running their operations with the strategic foresight and prestige of a break-room coffee station.
The intellectual weight of that specific juxtaposition is profound. By placing the lofty, self-important rhetoric of the Qajar state next to the lowly image of a pantry, Khan exposed the complete failure of these superficial reforms.
It's such a devastating insult.
It really is. He was arguing that simply copying the external bureaucratic structures of Europe, like setting up a Ministry of Defense or a Ministry of Justice, was entirely useless without the underlying principles of true equitable law and what he repeatedly referred to as humanity.
Right.
He was diagnosing a hollow modernization, a state that wore the clothes of a modern nation but retained the arbitrary, despotic heart of an absolute monarchy.
And this intense tension between adopting modern, often European concepts, and maintaining indigenous authenticity wasn't limited to just politics. It bled deeply into philosophy and religion. We really have to map out the incredible 1883 intellectual exchange between the highly influential Islamic reformer Jamal al-Din al-Afghani and the famous French thinker Ernest Renan.
Yes, this exchange is widely considered a foundational text for modern Islamic thought. It perfectly encapsulates the intellectual friction of the era. So Renan had given a highly publicized lecture at the Sorbonne in Paris.
And what was his argument?
In it, he argued, with profound and explicit racist undertones, that Islam was inherently hostile to science and rational thought. He posited that the Arab mind was fundamentally biologically incapable of deep philosophical inquiry.
That's a huge, incredibly offensive claim. And al-Afghani fires back in a widely published response, right? And he does it with such intellectual sophistication. He doesn't just get angry. He completely dismantles Renan's historical amnesia.
He certainly does.
He cites the massive, undeniable Arab contributions to philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine during the Middle Ages. He reminds Renan that when Europe was languishing in the Dark Ages, Arab and Islamic scholars were translating, preserving, and vastly expanding upon Greek philosophy.
He thoroughly corrects the historical record. But what elevates al-Afghani to the status of a truly great transcendent thinker is the second half of his argument. He doesn't just offer a defensive, localized apologetic for Islam.
What does he do?
He makes a profound philosophical concession that pivots the entire debate. He argues that all religions, at their very core, inherently struggle with reason.
Oh, wow. That's a bold stance for a religious reformer to take.
It is. He posits a sociological theory that humanity, in its early primitive stages, absolutely needed the heavy yoke of religious dogma to emerge from barbarism and establish moral order. However, he acknowledges an inherent structural conflict. Religion demands absolute, unquestioning faith, while science and philosophy demand constant, skeptical questioning.
So he's taking Renan's specific attack on Islam and turning it into a universal commentary on the human condition. He's basically telling Renan, you don't get to claim that European Christianity is somehow inherently more scientific or rational than Islam. You're just currently at a different point in your historical trajectory regarding the separation of the church from the laboratory.
Gets at the mechanism of his argument. He states that the struggle between dogma and free thought is not a unique pathology of Islam. It is a universal human struggle. It is a brilliant, universalist defense that transcends racial or national boundaries.
It positions the Islamic world not as inherently backwards, but as navigating the exact same painful intellectual transitions that Europe itself had to endure.
Precisely.
We see this deep, painful reflection on how to navigate modernity playing out in the cultural and social spheres as well. Let's look at two contrasting sources here. First, in the 1820s, we have the Egyptian scholar Rifa Tatawi. He was sent to Paris as an imam with an Egyptian military mission by Muhammad Ali Pasha.
Right, his travelogue is incredibly detailed.
Yeah, Tatawi writes these detailed observations of Parisian life, and he is struck by their sheer industriousness. He observes the streets, the reading habits of commoners, their scientific curiosity, and their civic organization. He is deeply, favorably impressed and desperately wants to bring this intellectual energy back to Egypt.
Tatali represents an early, somewhat optimistic phase of the encounter with Europe, where the goal was to observe, learn, and selectively import European advancements to strengthen the local state.
But then, contrast Tatawi's fascination with a speech given almost 90 years later in 1909 by a pioneering Egyptian thinker named Wahidat al-Badiya.
Oh, her speech is incredible.
She is speaking in Cairo, fiercely advocating for women's educational and economic rights. But the way she frames her argument is fascinating, because she is actively pushing back against the very European cultural influence that Tatawi was so interested in.
Badia's speech is a masterclass in the complex intellectual navigation required by reformers in the Middle East. She is forcefully arguing for the emancipation, employment, and education of women. But she knows those concepts are ones which many conservative elements in her society immediately dismiss as dangerous westernization.
All right, so how does she get around that?
To win her argument, Badia has to explicitly and publicly decouple modernity from westernization. She actively rejects the blind imitation of European customs.
Yeah, she specifically calls out things like upper-class Egyptian women adopting European dancing, or the concept of acting in love scenes on a theater stage. She refers to these practices as despicable and a detestable crossing of boundaries. To a modern ear, she might sound conservative, but in her context, what is she actually trying to achieve?
She is trying to construct a uniquely Egyptian Islamic framework for modernity. She is acutely aware that if the emancipation of women is seen purely as a Western import, it will be rejected by the culture at large. She doesn't want Egyptian women to become French women. She wants them to be educated, empowered Egyptian women.
That distinction is so important.
It is. She argues that the extreme traditional seclusion of Egyptian women is deeply harmful to the nation, rendering half the population useless. But she equally argues that the extreme unregulated freedom of European women, as she perceived it, is also socially destructive. She is seeking a rigorous middle path. She argues that educating women is essential for the health, intellect, and progress of the nation, but that this progress must be rooted firmly in indigenous moral and religious frameworks.
So let's connect these themes for the listener. Throughout the 19th century, we see Ottoman centralizers, satirical intellectuals like Malcolm Khan, philosophers like Al-Afghani, and social reformers like Badia, all wrestling with this massive question.
Right.
How do we create a modern, strong, educated society that can survive in a globalized world without losing our soul? They introduce concepts of constitutionalism, mass education, and the idea of a citizen. But by doing so, they inadvertently planted a seed that the old empires couldn't contain.
They unleashed something totally new.
Exactly. They unleashed the explosive, world-altering idea that a specific people, defined by a shared culture, language, or history, should have their own sovereign state.
And that profound intellectual shift leads us directly into the crucible of the early 20th century. Following the catastrophic collapse of the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire during World War I, the concept of the citizen morphed into something much more rigid and exclusionary: the ideology of nationalism. The Middle East transitioned from a relatively fluid geopolitical space of overlapping religious and regional identities into a map about to be carved up by strict borders. Political legitimacy was suddenly violently tied to ethnic, linguistic, or historical purity.
The primary sources we have mapping out the forge of nationalism are incredibly detailed. Let's look at how these various nationalisms were intellectually constructed, starting with Zionism. In 1882, we have a text from Leo Pinsker, a Jewish physician and intellectual from Russia, who publishes a pamphlet titled Auto-Emancipation.
Yes.
And to understand his mindset, you have to know he is writing in the immediate bloody aftermath of horrific, widespread anti-Jewish pogroms across the Russian Empire.
The context of those pogroms is the engine of his entire philosophy. Pinsker's core argument represents a deep structural pessimism regarding the promises of the European Enlightenment.
How so?
For decades, many Jewish intellectuals believed that as Europe became more modern, secular, and democratic, anti-Semitism would naturally fade, and Jewish people would assimilate as equal citizens. Pinsker argues that this was a tragic illusion. He diagnoses Judeophobia in Europe not as a temporary political prejudice, but as an incurable, deep-seated psychological and social disease.
He argues that because the Jewish people lack a sovereign state, they exist everywhere as a ghost nation, a minority that inherently triggers suspicion and hostility in the majority populations among whom they live.
Precisely his logic. He concludes that the Jewish people will never be fully assimilated or accepted as equals in European societies, regardless of how much they contribute. Therefore, he argues, waiting for Europe to become tolerant is suicidal. The only logical solution, the only way to achieve true, lasting emancipation is to fundamentally alter their condition by establishing a distinct Jewish homeland, geographically separated from Europe, where they are the absolute majority.
I'm reading this and thinking about the intellectual climate of the time. This is a massive, radical proposition. Was there immediate consensus?
Yeah.
I have to imagine that within the highly diverse global Jewish intellectual community, there was serious debate about transitioning from a religious and cultural identity into a purely political, territorial nation-state.
The debate was intense, immediate, and deeply philosophical. The sources point us to Ahad Ha'am, a prominent intellectual who wrote a severe critique of purely political Zionism in 1897. Hama attended the early Zionist congresses, observed the proceedings, and walked away deeply alarmed.
What was he so worried about?
He warned against the singular focus on political statecraft and territorial acquisition.
He argues for something he calls spiritual Zionism. But what does spiritual mean in this context? He isn't just talking about praying more, is he?
No, by spiritual, he means cultural and moral identity. Ha'am argued that simply establishing a physical state with a Jewish demographic majority wasn't enough to solve the crisis of Jewish identity. He feared that if this new state lacked a deep, rigorous grounding in traditional Jewish ethics, culture, and intellectual heritage, it would end up being just another generic, potentially aggressive European-style nation-state.
So it would be Jewish in name only.
Exactly. Furthermore, he warned that a hyper-focus on building a political state could lead to moral decay and ultimately alienate the vast Jewish diaspora, the millions of Jews who would likely never move to this new state. He wanted a cultural center that would radiate intellectual and moral inspiration to the diaspora, not just a fortress.
It's a profound debate about the very soul and ultimate purpose of a nationalist movement. Is the goal mere physical survival or the preservation of a unique moral heritage? And we see similarly complex, fiercely competing visions when we look at the primary sources detailing the birth of Arab nationalism. Intellectuals across the region were scrambling to figure out exactly what constituted the Arab nation.
The definitional boundaries were heavily contested. On one hand, you have figures like Antoun Saada, who founded the Syrian Social Nationalist Party in the 1930s. He argued passionately for a concept of Greater Syria, a nation that would encompass modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and parts of Iraq.
So his vision of nationalism was deeply geographic and historical.
Very much so. He deliberately bypassed the more recent Islamic and Arab conquests, rooting the nation's identity instead in the ancient pre-Islamic history of Mesopotamia and the Levant. He argued for a unique, distinct Syrian civilization tied intrinsically to that specific geography.
But then you contrast that regional vision with Michel Aflaq in 1943. Aflaq is laying the intellectual and ideological groundwork for what would become the immensely powerful Ba'ath Party.
Right.
He formulates a much broader pan-Arab nationalism based not on strict geography, but on a shared language, shared culture, and a shared historical struggle. And his relationship with religion, specifically Islam, is one of the most fascinating intellectual tightropes in the sources.
It is incredibly nuanced, and it explains a lot about how nationalist movements build mass appeal. Michel Aflaq was an Orthodox Christian. He was a secular thinker, heavily influenced by his education in Paris. Yet, he was a political pragmatist.
He knew he had to factor Islam in.
Yes. He understood clearly that you could not possibly build a massive popular nationalist movement in the Arab world if you alienated or ignored the deep, pervasive influence of Islam.
So how does a secular Christian incorporate Islam into a nationalist ideology without turning it into a theocracy?
He does it by redefining Islam not as a strict set of theological laws to be governed by, but as a cultural and historical engine. He argued that the historical emergence of Islam in the 7th century was the vital jolt that awakened the Arab spirit and propelled them onto the world stage. He posited that even for non-Muslim Arabs like himself, Islam was the foundational cultural heritage of their civilization. It provided the language, the shared ethics, and the historical glory of the Arab people. It was a brilliant, if highly controversial, intellectual maneuver. He managed to fuse a modern secular ethnic nationalism with the deeply felt religious pride of the region, creating a potent ideological force.
But history, particularly the history of the 20th century, shows us that this desperate drive to forge a cohesive, homogeneous nation-state has a terrifying dark side. The pursuit of national purity, the idea that a state must belong entirely to one specific ethnic or cultural group, often leads to the horrific persecution, expulsion, or extermination of anyone who doesn't fit the newly defined mold.
It is the most tragic consequence of exclusionary nationalism, and we must look at the historical record impartially to understand the mechanisms of how this occurs. One of the most sobering primary sources from this period is the collection of 1915 accounts and diplomatic cables from United States Ambassador Henry Morgenthau regarding the Armenian genocide.
Yeah, these are incredibly difficult to read.
Morgenthau was stationed in Istanbul and had direct, face-to-face conversations with the leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress, commonly known as the Young Turks, who had seized control of the collapsing Ottoman Empire.
Morgenthau's accounts are chilling, not just because of the scale of the violence they describe, but because of the sheer bureaucratic ideological calculation they reveal behind the violence. He meticulously documents his conversations with Talat Pasha, the Ottoman Minister of the Interior, and one of the primary architects of the genocide.
The contextual analysis of these documents reveals the cold, modern logic of ethnic cleansing. The Committee of Union and Progress was obsessed with a specific vision of nationalism. They wanted to forge a homogeneous Turkish ethno-state out of the ruins of a massive multi-ethnic empire.
So how did they view the Armenians?
They viewed the Armenian minority, who were distinct in religion, language, and often well-educated and economically successful, not as fellow citizens, but as an inherent existential threat to this new nationalist purity. The mechanism of genocide here wasn't an ancient, irrational hatred. It was a modern, calculated policy of state-building through eradication.
The documents show Morgenthau actually tries to appeal to Talat Pasha logically. He warns him of the massive economic damage the empire will suffer by destroying its own Armenian business class, the merchants and artisans. And Talat's response, as recorded by Morgenthau, is devastating.
What do you see?
Talat essentially acknowledges the economic loss, but argues that the mutual hatred and suspicion between the groups was now so intense that the state had to finish the job to prevent any future possibility of Armenian revenge. It is the ultimate tragic extreme of nationalist logic.
Yeah.
The belief that the state can only be secure if the other is entirely eliminated.
It really highlights how the seemingly academic question of who belongs to the nation instantly becomes a matter of life and death.
Absolutely.
But the sources show us that even in less extreme circumstances, the definition of the nation was highly fluid, constantly debated, and fiercely contested by its own people. A perfect example of this is the 1920 Syrian parliamentary debate on women's suffrage.
This specific transcript is a goldmine for understanding the mechanics of early nationalism and how identities are actively constructed. You have a room full of male politicians in Damascus attempting to draft a constitution for a newly proposed independent Syrian state, and they are fiercely arguing over whether women should have the right to vote.
And the way they argue is so revealing.
Think about the political debates you hear on the news today, right? You have politicians constantly manipulating history, quoting founding fathers or religious texts to fit their current, immediate agenda. Well, look at Damascus in 1920. The rhetoric is identical in its mechanics. You have one conservative MP standing up and arguing that giving women the vote is a dangerous, corrupting Western innovation that will destroy the traditional family structure of the nation.
But the truly fascinating moment is the rebuttal. A progressive MP stands up and completely flips the script. He doesn't argue that Syria needs to copy Europe. Instead, he argues that the West is actually just catching up to Islamic tradition.
That's a clever move.
It is. He points out that Islam gave women independent legal rights, the right to own property, and the right to conduct business over 1,000 years ago, long before European women had such rights.
They are both weaponizing the exact same Islamic history and making comparisons with Europe to argue fundamentally opposing points about what the modern Syrian nation should look like. It proves that the nation wasn't some eternal, fixed reality that everyone agreed upon. It was being actively constructed, negotiated, and fought over in real time.
And this intense fluidity and contestation over the land, its identity, and its future is nowhere more complex or enduring than in the primary documents surrounding the future of Palestine during the British Mandate period.
It's definitely one of the most intense sections of our source material.
To truly understand this deeply rooted conflict, we must examine the primary sources from the different stakeholders, presenting the stated arguments of the documents impartially to map the intellectual collision course.
Right. We have several key memorandums that lay out entirely incompatible visions for the exact same territory. First, we have the 1919 Zionist Organization's official memorandum submitted to the Supreme Council at the Peace Conference in Versailles.
In this highly detailed document, the Zionist organization formally asks the international community to legally recognize the historic title of the Jewish people to Palestine and the right of the Jews to reconstitute their national home there. What is notable for researchers is the specificity of the document.
What kind of details did they include?
They don't just rely on historical or biblical claims. They lay out precise geographical boundaries they argue are absolutely required for the economic viability of the new state. They particularly focus on securing access to crucial water resources like the Jordan River and Mount Hermon. The argument intricately weaves together the deep historical connection of the Jewish people to the land with the pragmatic, strategic necessity of building a self-sustaining, modern, safe haven.
Then, standing in direct opposition to that vision, we have the 1946 evidence submitted by the Arab Office in Jerusalem to the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry.
Yes. The Arab Office's memorandum argues vehemently from the perspective of the existing Arab majority population. Their core argument is that the ultimate stated aim of Zionism, the establishment of a sovereign Jewish state, would inevitably and unavoidably result in the political and potentially physical displacement of the indigenous Arab population.
And they base this on the mechanics of immigration, right?
Exactly. They argue that the continuous, organized immigration of Jewish settlers, heavily backed by foreign capital and organizational expertise, will eventually marginalize the Arab agricultural class, leading to deep economic disenfranchisement and the loss of their political right to self-determination in their own land.
It's a clash of two absolute nationalist imperatives. But crucially, the sources also show us that the binary outcome we see today wasn't the only idea on the table at the time. There were alternative intellectual visions being proposed that desperately tried to avoid a zero-sum, winner-take-all outcome.
Yes, the archives also contain detailed proposals for a binational state, championed by prominent intellectuals like the philosopher Martin Buber and organizations like Brit Shalom. These thinkers argued against dividing the land into exclusionary sovereign units.
So what did they suggest instead?
Instead, they proposed a federal multinational state based on the absolute political parity of both nationalities, regardless of who happened to hold the demographic majority at any given time.
How would that actually work in practice? It sounds incredibly difficult to implement.
They specifically cited Switzerland as a working model. In Switzerland, different linguistic and cultural groups, French, German, Italian, maintain their distinct cultural identities, their own schools, and their own languages, while sharing a single, unified political citizenship and federal government.
So they separate the nation from the state.
Exactly. The binationalists hope to replicate this, separating the concept of cultural nationhood from political statehood to allow both Jews and Arabs to call the entirety of the land their home.
So we see all these incredibly detailed intellectual blueprints, these utopian dreams for new nations. We have the Zionists, the Pan-Arabists, the binationalists. But as we transition into the post-World War II era, these grand, optimistic visions crash headfirst into brutal geopolitical realities.
They really do.
The attempts to build democratic, consensus-based nations largely failed across the region. And what rose from the ashes of those failed democratic experiments were states that relied almost entirely on brute force and coercion.
This marks the transition into the era of the authoritarian state, which resulted in a profound, lingering crisis of legitimacy across the Middle East. Having failed to deliver on the lofty nationalist promises of rapid economic prosperity, social equality, and true independence from foreign influence, the regimes in power began to rely heavily on the backing of the military, massive bureaucratic control, secret police, and state-sponsored violence.
They just tightened their grip on everything.
They tried to establish total control not just over the physical borders of their nations, but over the very minds and histories of their citizens.
A perfect and frankly terrifying primary source demonstrating this comes from Saddam Hussein. We have transcripts of his speeches to educational committees from the 1970s. This is before he officially became president, when he was serving as the vice president, but was widely recognized as the true power behind the throne in Iraq.
Hussein explicitly and unashamedly outlines a totalitarian vision of education. He argues to his ministers that history must not be taught as an objective pursuit of facts or as a tool for critical thinking. Instead, he views history purely as an instrument of state power.
It's pure propaganda.
Exactly. It must be actively manipulated to educate the masses about the glory and inevitability of the Ba'ath Revolution.
He literally instructs them that they must paint the entire era before the revolution as a time of total darkness, exploitation, and misery, so that the achievements of the Ba'ath Party appear even brighter and more miraculous to the youth. He is demanding the deliberate, systematic construction of a state mythology to legitimize his authoritarian control. He's trying to manufacture loyalty by erasing the truth.
But as history continually proves, state propaganda can only mask underlying reality for so long. Eventually, the severe structural weaknesses, the corruption, and the incompetence of these authoritarian states are exposed to the public. In the modern Middle East, the defining cataclysmic moment of exposure was the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, often called the Six-Day War.
That was a huge turning point.
The rapid, total, and humiliating military defeat of the combined Arab armies, particularly Egypt, which under Gamal Abdel Nasser was the self-proclaimed leader of the progressive, modern Arab world, was a devastating psychological shock to the entire region.
We have Gamal Abdel Nasser's resignation speech, which he broadcast on the radio, and it is a moment of profound, visceral national trauma. But to really understand the deep intellectual and philosophical fallout of this defeat, we look to the Syrian philosopher Sadiq al-Azm. In 1968, he published a blistering, highly controversial book called Self-Criticism After the Defeat.
Al-Azm's analysis is an act of incredible intellectual rigor and, given the political climate, immense personal courage. Following the shocking military defeat, there was a widespread, fascinating sociological phenomenon in Egypt.
Oh, the apparitions, right.
Yes. Hundreds of thousands of people claimed to see glowing apparitions of the Virgin Mary hovering over a Coptic church in Zaytun, a suburb of Cairo. It became a mass event. I mean, even the secular state-run newspapers were reporting these sightings as factual miracles.
Yeah.
Al-Azm viciously attacked this public reaction.
He didn't just dismiss it, he diagnosed it. He called it mass religious hysteria. But why was he so angry about people finding comfort in a religious vision during a time of crisis?
Because he argued that the Arab public, completely traumatized and humiliated by the military defeat, was retreating into superstition, mysticism, and irrationality. They were desperately looking for a literal miracle from the heavens because they couldn't face the harsh, agonizing reality on the ground.
Which was what?
That their modern, secular, heavily militarized states were completely, fundamentally broken. They were technologically outmatched, scientifically backwards, and bureaucratically corrupt. Al-Azm argued that hiding behind apparitions and waiting for divine intervention was a coward's way of avoiding the incredibly hard, rational scientific work required to actually build a competent, functioning modern society that could defend itself.
Wow. He was exposing the complete ideological bankruptcy of the state. He was saying the state promised us modernity, and it delivered a devastating defeat. And this structural failure of the state wasn't just military, it was political and civic, as seen tragically in Lebanon.
Yes, Lebanon is a stark example.
Let's examine the primary documents from the outbreak of the 1975 Lebanese Civil War, specifically an intellectual exchange between two prominent political leaders, Kamal Jumblat, a Druze leader and head of the Lebanese national movement, and Pierre Gemayel, a Maronite Christian leader.
To understand their debate, we have to understand the mechanism of the Lebanese state. Lebanon was built upon a system of sectarian power sharing known as confessionalism. Political offices, parliamentary seats, and high-level bureaucratic jobs were strictly doled out based on religious demographics derived from a census taken way back in 1932.
So the president had to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, the speaker of parliament a Shia Muslim, and so on. But how does that system actually lead to the outbreak of a 15-year civil war? What is the specific mechanism of failure?
Jumblat articulates the mechanism perfectly in his memorandums. He argues that this rigid sectarian system explicitly prevents true democratic representation and basic civic functioning. When you lock every single political decision into a sectarian quota, you freeze the state.
Give me an example of how that plays out.
Imagine trying to build a new highway or even just organize trash collection. In a functional state, you base the decision on engineering and civic need. In the sectarian system, building a road in a Sunni district, but not a Christian district, becomes a major national crisis of representation.
Right. Every single pothole becomes a religious issue.
Precisely. It prevented the development of a unified, merit-based national army. It prevented equitable economic development. And most importantly, when demographic realities naturally changed over 40 years, meaning the 1932 census was no longer accurate, the inflexible system couldn't adapt to give rising populations their fair share of power.
It is a pressure cooker.
The resulting friction, the inability of the state to govern effectively or adapt democratically, inevitably ignited into a brutal, devastating civil war.
So let's look at the landscape by the late 1970s and 1980s. You have this massive, gaping ideological vacuum across the Middle East. The secular, nationalist, authoritarian states had failed militarily against Israel in 1967. They were failing to provide economic prosperity to their booming populations, and they were structurally collapsing into violence, like in Lebanon.
The promise of secular nationalism was completely dead.
Right. But nature, especially political nature, abhors a vacuum. Something had to fill the void.
And that vacuum was aggressively filled by the dramatic rise of political Islam. The mechanism for this is crucial to understand. Because the authoritarian regimes had systematically crushed, imprisoned, or exiled all secular, leftist, liberal, or democratic opposition over the previous decades, the only safe space left for public gathering, mass communication, and anti-government discourse was the mosque.
Because the state couldn't shut down Friday prayers.
Exactly. So opposition naturally took on a religious vocabulary, but this shift toward political Islam sparked fierce and often deadly intellectual battles within the Middle East itself.
We really need to unpack the underlying theology and ideology that fueled this radical shift. The primary text here is by Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian intellectual and leading member of the Muslim Brotherhood who published a highly influential, explosive book in 1964 called Milestones.
Qutb is arguably the foundational theorist for almost all modern militant Sunni Islamism. To understand his impact, we have to see how he completely redefines core Islamic concepts, particularly the concept of jihad.
How is it viewed before him?
Before Qutb, many mainstream Islamic scholars, often adopting a somewhat apologetic tone in the face of aggressive Western criticism, argued that jihad was strictly a defensive concept. They said it was only permissible to use armed force if the physical homeland of Islam was directly attacked by an outside army.
But Qutb rejects that defensive posture entirely, right? He calls it a defeatist mentality. In Milestones, he maps out a proactive, aggressive, and expansive intellectual and physical landscape. He argues that jihad is not just about defending territory. It is the active, continuous annihilation of any political, social, or material power that stands between the people and the establishment of God's absolute sovereignty on earth.
And the crucial intellectual maneuver Qutb makes, the pivot that changes history, is how he defines the enemy. He resurrects an ancient Islamic concept called jahiliyyah.
Which means what?
Historically, jahiliyyah refers strictly to the state of ignorance and paganism in Arabia before the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. It basically meant the days of ignorance.
But Qutb takes that ancient concept of pagan ignorance and applies it directly to the 1960s.
Yes. He argues that the existing modern secular Arab states like Nasser's Egypt, which was currently imprisoning him, are actually living in a modern state of jahiliyyah. Why? Because they rule by man-made laws, constitutions, and socialist decrees, rather than by divine Sharia law. Therefore, they are not legitimate Muslim governments. They are apostate regimes.
So, by officially labeling the Arab governments as apostates living in a state of jahiliyyah, Qutb is essentially providing the theological justification for citizens to declare holy war on their own existing governments. He is giving them permission to rebel.
That is the exact mechanism. He viewed the secular state as fundamentally illegitimate by definition. His ideology broke the traditional Islamic prohibition against rebelling against a ruler, providing the theological blueprint and justification for citizens to take up arms against their own states. This specific argument laid the explicit groundwork for the assassinations and militant movements that would plague the region for decades.
But it's critical for the listener to understand that this militant interpretation did not go unchallenged within Arab society. There was a fierce, highly articulate secular counterattack. A prime example from the sources is Farag Foda, an incredibly brave Egyptian intellectual, journalist, and human rights activist.
Foda is a vital figure. During the 1980s and early 90s, as Islamist movements gained significant political and cultural ground in Egypt, Foda used his public platform, his newspaper columns, and televised debates to relentlessly critique and mock their ideology. Crucially, he possessed a deep scholarly knowledge of Islamic theology, which he weaponized to systematically dismantle extremist arguments from the inside.
He coined this brilliant, highly effective term, the fake of vexation. Fake refers to Islamic jurisprudence, the complex human understanding and application of Sharia law. Fouad pointed out the complete absurdity of extremist clerics who seemed obsessively focused on banning anything that brought ordinary people joy. He gives a famous, deeply relatable example regarding a song.
Yes, the controversy over a song by the legendary Egyptian musician Muhammad Abdel Wahab. The song contained a poetic lyric that translated roughly to, "We do not know why we are born nor where we are going." It's an expression of existential wonder.
But the hardline Islamists lost their minds over it. They formally declared the singer a heretic because, according to their rigid theology, every Muslim absolutely knows exactly why they are born, to praise and serve God. So expressing doubt in a pop song is heresy.
And Fouad's response was just brilliant.
He openly mocked these clerics. He argued that they don't actually care about deep theology or the spiritual health of the nation. They practice the fake of vexation. Their only goal is to vex people, to control them, and to ruin their happiness by policing their every move.
Fouad argued passionately and rigorously that Islam is a great world religion and should remain a matter of deep personal faith and moral guidance. But it must absolutely not be used as a coercive system of public governance or state law. His rigorous, highly public, and highly popular secular arguments were considered so profoundly threatening to the Islamist narrative that he was assassinated by the militant group Al-Ghama al-Islamiyya in 1992.
It's horrific. He was shot right in front of his son.
His death vividly underscores the absolute mortal stakes of this intellectual battle over the soul of the state.
And when we look at the state's response to these rising Islamist movements, we see that it was often characterized by sheer, unmitigated brutality. And ironically, that state brutality only poured gasoline on the fire. We have to look at the primary sources surrounding the 1982 Hama massacre in Syria.
Using literature and memoirs produced by members of the Muslim Brotherhood itself, we can intimately examine the profound psychological impact of massive state violence. In 1982, the Syrian regime, led by Hafez al-Assad, decided to brutally and permanently suppress an armed Islamist uprising in the city of Hama.
What happened?
The military surrounded the city and essentially leveled entire residential neighborhoods using artillery and airstrikes, killing thousands of their own citizens, mostly civilians in the process.
The primary document we have from the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood describes the trauma of this event in apocalyptic, world-ending terms. They compare the secular regime to Nero burning Rome to the ground.
What's crucial for researchers here is not just establishing the historical fact of the massacre, but analyzing how it was internalized and interpreted by the opposition. The absolute, unrestrained brutality of the Hama massacre became a potent rallying cry. It served as proof for Quathabad's theories.
It validated his narrative.
It did. It convinced an entire generation of Islamists across the region that peaceful political participation or democratic reform was a naive fantasy, and that the secular Arab state was a monstrous, irredeemable entity that only understood extreme violence. State oppression didn't eliminate the movement. It deeply radicalized political Islam, cementing a tragic, ongoing cycle of violence and retaliation.
Okay, so if we pause here and look at the narrative we've built so far, it has been very top-down. We've spent an hour talking about the grand schemes of empires, the decrees of dictators, the theories of prominent intellectuals, and the ideologies of militant leaders. It feels like a massive binary struggle. The oppressive, heavily armed state versus radical, uncompromising religion.
Right, that's the macro view.
But as we transition our focus into the 21st century, the primary sources reveal something entirely different. Beneath the surface of these grand political narratives, everyday people, the marginalized, the youth, the groups academics refer to as the subaltern, are quietly, subversively reshaping the Middle East on their own terms.
To properly contextualize this contemporary landscape and understand these marginalized voices, we must first briefly address the defining geopolitical earthquake of the early 21st century, the September 11th attacks and the subsequent U.S. invasion of Iraq. The primary sources offer dual, deeply conflicting intellectual narratives about the root causes of this era.
Let's lay those out.
As researchers, we present these arguments impartially to understand the intellectual climate that the youth of the region are growing up in.
So on one side of the debate, we have an analysis by the scholar Ihsan Arari. He argues that while American policies played a role, the true roots of 9/11 lay deep within the structural flaws of Arab societies themselves. He points heavily to the chronic lack of democratic institutions, the suffocating corruption of authoritarian regimes, and failing educational systems that don't prepare youth for the modern economy.
So he's looking mostly inward.
Yeah, in his view, this deeply oppressive internal environment creates a pervasive sense of despair and humiliation that breeds radical extremism. Therefore, the primary enemy of the Arab people is their own internal authoritarianism.
Contrast that internal diagnosis with the argument presented by Muna Shakar. She posits that while internal governance issues certainly exist, the primary driving force behind the immense anger that fueled movements like al-Qaeda was United States foreign policy. She points to a perceived American arrogance, specifically the post-9/11 with us or against us rhetoric and the long-standing, often covert interventions in the region.
So her argument is more structural and global.
Yes. She argues that when Western powers view freedom and democracy merely as universal American exports to be imposed by force, it ignores how American power is actually experienced often violently by everyday people on the ground in the Middle East.
And this intense ideological clash directly informs the primary sources surrounding the 2003 Iraq War. We have the transcript of President George W. Bush's speeches, framing the invasion as a necessary, preemptive strike against a gathering threat of weapons of mass destruction. He morally justifies it as a mission to bring democratic freedom to a region defined by tyranny.
But alongside those speeches, the archives contain the prescient warnings from figures like Brent Scowcroft, a highly respected former U.S. national security advisor. Writing before the invasion began, Scowcroft argued from a strict realist perspective. He warned that forcefully overthrowing the Iraqi regime would severely destabilize the entire Middle East, inflame anti-American sentiment, and fatally distract resources from the actual fight against the al-Qaeda network.
And crucially, as we read the post-invasion analytical documents, we have to reevaluate our understanding of the horrific sectarian violence, the Sunni-Shia civil war that engulfed Iraq. The popular narrative in Western media often claimed this was the inevitable eruption of ancient, thousands of years old hatreds that were finally unbottled.
The deep analysis in the sources thoroughly refutes that ancient hatreds trope. The document suggests that the hyper-violent sectarianism in Iraq was a decidedly modern political outcome.
What was the real trigger then?
The mechanism was the sudden, total destruction of the Iraqi state apparatus, the disbanding of the army, the purging of the bureaucracy during the invasion. When the state completely collapses and there is no police force to protect you and no government to provide services, people naturally retreat to their most basic, primal identity groups.
Like their tribe or their religious sect?
Exactly. Their tribe, their sect, their militia, simply for physical survival. The violence wasn't an ancient religious debate. It was a modern struggle for power and survival in a manufactured power vacuum.
It's a grim reality. But beyond the wars, the geopolitics, and the violence, the most surprising, vibrant, and ultimately hopeful primary sources in our collection come from the margins of society. These are the micro-narratives that completely shatter those Western stereotypes we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the incredible political subversion of Leyla Zana.
Leyla Zana is a prominent Kurdish activist and was the first Kurdish woman elected to the parliament in Turkey. To understand her actions, you must know that the Turkish state has historically maintained a very strict, unyielding nationalist narrative that for decades essentially denied the distinct cultural and linguistic existence of the Kurdish minority. Zana wrote a brilliant, widely circulated open letter to the wife of the Turkish prime minister.
The rhetorical strategy of the letter is a masterpiece. Zana completely bypasses all the rigid, masculine, aggressive nationalist dogma that usually defines the conflict between the state and the Kurdish minority. Instead, she deliberately uses the deeply emotional, gendered language of motherhood. She writes specifically about the Saturday Mothers.
Could you explain who they are for the listener?
Sure. The Saturday Mothers are a group of mostly Kurdish women who gathered every week in Istanbul to peacefully protest and demand answers about their children who had been disappeared or killed by state security forces. Zana appeals to the First Lady not as a rival politician, but simply as a fellow mother. She argues that the unbearable grief of losing a child transcends all ethnic borders and political ideologies. She is brilliantly using her marginalized identity as a woman and a mother to politically subvert and humanize the oppressive state apparatus.
We see a similar, deeply practical subversion of high-level political rhetoric when we look at sociological documents exploring the dynamics on the soccer pitch in Israel. The analysis of Arab and Jewish Israeli soccer players playing on the same professional teams reveals a fascinating, complex reality. While politicians in the parliament argue endlessly over the exclusionary nature of the state and the exact borders of the nation, these players and their coaches are forced into a daily, highly pragmatic integration.
Right, because ideology doesn't win soccer matches. If you want to score a goal and win the championship, the Jewish midfielder has to pass the ball to the Arab striker. They have to trust each other's physical movements, celebrate together, and lose together. The mechanism of the sport forces a recognition of shared humanity, shared effort, and shared goals that entirely contradicts the segregated, hostile political narratives operating just outside the stadium.
Exactly. The sport creates a microsociety where competence and cooperation supersede ethnic division. And then we have the primary sources detailing the incredibly dynamic youth culture across the Middle East, which is just exploding with internal contradictions and creativity. For instance, there is a fascinating sociological report from Beirut focusing on young women who choose to wear the hijab. Traditionally, the hijab is viewed, both by conservative clerics and by Western observers, as a symbol of strict religious modesty and passive observance.
Yet, the text details how these exact same young women in Beirut are completely subverting that expectation. They are wearing the hijab, but they are also openly dating, they are embracing their boyfriends in public spaces like the Corniche, and they are actively negotiating their own sexualities and relationships.
They are completely redefining religious boundaries on their own terms. The academic analysis here is that they are actively rejecting the false binary choice presented to them by society, the idea that they must be either a secular, liberated Westerner who abandons her religion or a passive, oppressed traditionalist who stays hidden at home.
So they're creating a third path.
By combining visible religious devotion with modern social freedoms, they are carving out a complex hybrid identity that is authentically their own, deeply confusing both conservative clerics and Western feminists in the process.
You see this exact same brilliant hybridity in the music scene. We have extensive sources detailing the rapid rise of Arab hip-hop and heavy metal in highly conservative places like Saudi Arabia and Morocco. Young people are taking these distinctly Western or globally recognized musical genres, but they aren't just copying them. They are infusing them with local Arabic slang, traditional instruments like the oud, and regional beats.
What's fascinating to researchers here is the mechanism of cultural appropriation in reverse. How do they use this music? They use it to connect with global youth struggles against economic alienation, police brutality, and disenfranchisement. A rapper uploading tracks from Riyadh isn't just mimicking American culture. He is actively using the aggressive, truth-telling tools of hip-hop to subvert the rigid, state-sponsored conservatism of his own local traditions.
And simultaneously defying Western stereotypes.
Exactly. Simply by existing and being vocal, he is defying Western expectations of what an Arab youth should sound or act like. It is a powerful artistic assertion of a complex, modern, globalized identity.
This intense desire for a new, progressive narrative, for a voice that transcends the old conflicts, brings us to our final set of documents, which capture the overwhelming region-wide reaction to the 2008 election of Barack Obama in the United States.
The source material here is invaluable because it juxtaposes the regional perception of two diametrically opposed figures, Barack Obama and Osama bin Laden. For decades, the dominant anti-Western narrative was monopolized by figures like bin Laden, who represented a highly destructive, backward-looking ideology that thrived on despair, hopelessness, and extreme violence.
And Obama was the antithesis of that.
Obama, conversely, represented a progressive democratic narrative. His election demonstrated to the world that a massive society could actually confront its own deeply racist, divided past through democratic means and elect a man of minority heritage and a Hussein middle name to its highest office.
The text highlights a highly specific, amazing micro-detail that blew my mind. Arab Americans living in South Lebanon, people whose actual physical villages had previously been damaged by American-made munitions during various conflicts, were enthusiastically organizing and voting for Obama via absentee ballot.
It's an incredible detail.
That single detail shatters so many assumptions. It shows a Middle East that is not inherently blindly anti-American. It reveals a population that is deeply admiring of true democratic ideals and totally comfortable with hybrid transnational identities. They're desperate for an America and a global order that actually lives up to its own stated ideals of freedom and equality, rather than just using those words as cover for imperialism.
It perfectly illustrates the ultimate finding of our research today. The people of the Middle East absolutely cannot be reduced to simple caricatures or monolithic blocks. They are navigating incredibly complex, rapidly shifting political, economic, and cultural landscapes with profound nuance, intelligence, and agency.
So let's synthesize this incredible sweeping journey for the listener. We started our deep dive in the 19th century, watching struggling empires try to mathematically transform their subjects into useful citizens to survive European dominance. We saw how the creation of that educated citizenry inadvertently birthed the utopian but ultimately exclusionary and violent dreams of nationalism.
Right.
We watched those ambitious nationalist states fail to deliver, giving way to the crushing reality of brutal authoritarianism, which in turn sparked the violent rise of radical political Islam. But today, right now, as we dive into the sources from the 21st century, we see the youth, women, and marginalized groups bypassing the archaic structures of the state entirely, using music, sports, and technology to write a completely new hybrid script for their region.
If there's one crucial overarching takeaway from reading this massive stack of primary sources, it is that history is never a monolith. The Middle East is not a static place trapped in amber, doomed to repeat ancient conflicts. The people living there have always been active intellectual agents. They have been debating theology, writing constitutions, satirizing their leaders, protesting in the streets and fighting for their futures, employing the exact same intellectual vigor, internal contradiction, and human complexity as people do everywhere else in the world.
Which brings us right back to that broken X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning of the show. For 2 centuries, the Middle East has been subjected to massive, top-down, heavy-handed ideological projects. Ottoman imperial decrees, pan-Arab nationalism, the ethist authoritarianism, political Islam, Western military interventions.
So many external pressures.
Everyone, from sultans to presidents, trying to force the region into a clean binary diagnosis so they can control it. But the reality on the ground is beautifully, defiantly messy. As you look at the youth uploading subversive hip-hop tracks from Riyadh, or young women actively redefining their faith and freedom on the bustling streets of Beirut, we have to leave you with this final thought. What happens to the future of the Middle East when the ultimate power to define identity permanently shifts away from the decrees of the state and into the smartphone in the hands of the individual? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.